Hi, thanks everyone for watching. And Steven.E.Birchfield has joined me today uh, for the first time, surprisingly, because I've been in touch with Steven for quite long, even if it is less in terms of time range, but the frequency has been very often. So I mean, I should have done this, before itself. But thank you, Steven, for joining today, and it's an absolute pleasure.
Ashwin, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be able to talk to you like this. We've talked many times, but never quite like this.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's the discussion that we are going to have today might raise a few eyebrows, but still, it's about making a transition into traditional astrology after being a modern astrologer or a psychological or an evolutionary astrologer for some time. And how do you make the transition into a traditional astrologer? Because it's not an easy transition, and it involves a lot of change of ideologies, philosophy, and approach towards astrology itself. So it can be demotivating, depressing, and whatnot. But on the other hand, it can also be enriching, and it could be soul enriching journey altogether. Because there is no, I mean, there is a lot of difference between modern and traditional astrology, but as astrology, it's all one and the same. So I thought you would be. I mean, I did not have any other person in mind when I thought of this topic, and because we already had on and off a lot of conversations offline, so which kind of touched upon this topic. So I thought it would be great to have a conversation with you on this topic itself. And on the social media, it's becoming really an irritable thing as far as modern versus traditional astrology goes, and it's becoming quite demotivating for so many people, because many people tend to put astrology into a bottle and close it and see, and they don't just do astrology. So they just do bottleology. So I thought, so I mean, it's important to kind of acknowledge various forms of astrology, but there is only so much that you can do with your life. So if at all you end up in crossroads, thinking what form of astrology you want to do, I think we hope to answer a few questions that you might have in mind. So yeah, so I don't know what is the best place to get started, but I think the basic idea would be to philosophically differentiate modern astrology and traditional astrology, because there has always been accusations on traditional astrology stating that traditional astrologers have always been obsessed with predictions. I tend to give an answer to them in such a way that, like, astrology is inherently predictive, and if you don't predict, then probably you're not doing astrology. You're doing some form of psychology or therapeutic, some other ology, but not astrology. So if prediction is not involved, then probably you're not doing astrology. So so astrology inherently has prediction as its major thing that is underlying. And philosophically, there is a lot of difference between modern and traditional astrology as well, because modern astrologers completely eliminated the phrases such as bad, worse, debilitating, or malefic from their dictionary itself. On the other hand, as traditional astrologers, we kind of embrace all those,
naughty words.
Yeah, naughty words to kind of enrich our inner beauty. So I think as traditional astrology, the underlying philosophy is far more important before even we start studying astrology, because if we go back in time, be it Vedic times or Hellenistic times or Persian times, or take Gita, or you take Plato, or you take Stoicism, or whatever it may be. It was all about finding answers from the universe, and astrology was once symbolism, once omenology, and later on it turned into cause and effect relationship. And finally, all this put together, we have determinism, or predefined life, or whatever it may be. So most of the things tend to be predefined, or tend to be appearing as if they are fated. But the difference actually lies in here, because modern astrologers tend to look at only the positive things in life, and most of the people would not agree that Saturn in Aries is necessarily a troublesome placement. So people might sugarcoat. I don't mean sugarcoat in a very negative sense, but still, if you ask me, I would kind of pick up 3 or 4 negative adjectives to especially, distinguish Aries. I mean, Saturn in Aries from Saturn in Libra. So, but a modern astrologer would probably associate the good things with Aries as well. So
Yes.
that's not what we do. So it's all about differentiating good and bad in life. So basically, we always had 2 things. I mean, coin has 2 sides. Parents are 2, and siblings are 2. So it's always like that. So it's important for us as a traditional astrologers to kind of embrace and agree with the 2 spectrums. I mean, 2 ends of the same spectrum, that is good and evil. So this would probably act as a foundational idea to kind of talk about this entire conversation in length. So it would be great to know what you have to say.
Well, it is that subject that actually caused me to leave modern astrology. I think I said this in an interview I had before. I studied modern astrology up until about 1991. And then the work I was doing, I did a lot of volunteer work in my life. I traveled I was in Africa, and I was in Eastern Europe. I was in India, as I told you. I was in Middle East. I was in a lot of different countries. In 91, I happened to, with my wife's brother, we were setting up an orphanage in Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia, right? And there was a lot of conflict down there. And I met a young lady there. She was early teens, 13, something, 14, I think, something like that. And, she asked me to do a chart reading, and being a modern astrologer at that time, it's like, you got to see positive in everything. You can't tell them anything negative. And then she started telling me her life, and her life was that in this conflict, she had a father and 9 brothers and 3 sisters, and her village was raided, and they killed her father and brothers in front of her, and then systematically raped her and her mother and her sisters. 13, 14-year-old girl. What do you tell them? Oh, well, this was just, how do you sugarcoat something like that?
Yeah.
You cannot sugarcoat it, There's just no way. You have to be. And I got very frustrated with modern astrology at that time. As a matter of fact, I stopped practicing astrology. For 1 whole year, I said, it's BS. I'm sorry, it's crap. There's nothing real about this. I can't talk to somebody who's had all these events happen in their life. And I mean bad events. There's nothing good about any of that. How do you tell them, well, buck up, cheer up, you're just got to turn it around and use it for your advantage, and try to, of course, you want to encourage people, but, that's not what happened in her life. It was a traumatic, and yet the girl was very bubbly. She was very sweet. She was loving. She was kind. you know, it's like for a young girl to have gone through that and had that trauma, I had to take off my hat to her because she was just a real sweetheart of a girl. Anyway, so it was a year after that I actually started with Project Hindsight had started, and I got involved there. So anyway, that was my kind of, this turning point was this discussion about good and evil.
Mm.
And how in modern astrology, they just can't say something's bad. This is what I found to be one of the biggest differences between traditional astrology and modern astrology. It's not the prediction, it's not any of this, but it's looking at life objectively.
Yeah.
Period. Looking at it objectively and saying, that was really bad, what happened. You can't sugarcoat that. I mean, of course, I'm kind of stoic in my beliefs anyway. So as a stoic, you try to see, okay, how can I use that to my best, you know? But that doesn't take away from the fact that it was still a malefic event in the girl's life. It was a horrible event, a traumatic experience. And this is what traditional astrology does, okay? You go in the text, and this can be a problem, I think, for some people, because they go into the text and you go from one extreme to the other. And that's all you see in the text is the two extremes. But in fact, in between, you have all kinds of variations. If you've done a lot of natal work with people and you've talked with people, you know that just because you have a luminary with a lot of spear bearers, for example, it doesn't mean they're going to be king. You know, it has to relate to that person. It has to relate in many different ways, socially, culturally. I mean, there is so many things that go into judgment of a chart. I was just recently, I was writing about longevity, you know, and I put it up on my website, you know, this article about it. And I was reading in Abu Mashar, you know, well, it wasn't Abu Mashar, but it was in Shaddam. And he was talking about Abu Mashar because he had asked him about longevity. He said, well, how do you know the length of life for this person? And so Abu Mashar said, well, when did this man's father die? I mean, that has nothing to do with astrology, right? Absolutely. He said, when did his father die? And he said, so-and-so. And he said, well, when did his mother die? And he said, well, so-and-so. Well, when did his grandfather die? Oh, his grandfather is still alive. So he said, well, when his high leg, when the releaser reaches the number of years of his grandfather, then there's a possibility he's going to die. I mean, it had nothing to do with all the delineation techniques we have around us. It blew me out of my chair. I was reading it and I was thinking, no, it was a little bit more practical than, you know, just looking at the high leg and, you know, looking at a killing planet, looking at all these things, you know. It was taking in fact, the guy's culture, his family heritage, genetics, right? That's what he was asking questions about, you know. Does he have genes? If his parents lived that long, then perhaps he's going to live just as long, or if not longer, you know. If his grandfather's still alive, maybe he's going to live that long. So it wasn't just... there was realism and objectivity to their astrology. And this is missing totally in modern astrology. Modern astrology is so subjective. They sugarcoat everything and write everything in order to build up a person's self-esteem. And in traditional astrology, we want to make people self-aware. Now that's a difference, right? Self-esteem, feeling good about yourself. There's nothing wrong with that in itself. But being self-aware and knowing, why do I make the choices that I make? Why do I make them? And it always seems to be, I make the same choices. You know, when faced with, you know, it's like we are programmed. I say programmed, not predestined or anything. But it seems like we're hardwired in our lives that we can make the same decisions again and again and again. And it takes a really harsh situation to make us change our attitudes and direction. But then we change what we do, not what we think, you know. It's so for me, that's the differences between the big transition between modern astrology traditional astrology is going from being subjective to being objective. I look in the last, when was it, in 2016, you had a whole range of astrologers, and they had a panel in America. They were making predictions about the outcome of the election.
Trump, yeah.
And there wasn't a single one that got it right. They win on the newspapers, and then they wonder why astrology has a bad name, right? Because everything was subjective. Every decision, they didn't, they just said, well, they bent a person's chart to make it subjective. First of all, they didn't even have a chart of Hillary Clinton. We have no time of birth for her. How do you cast it? How do you make a decision based on that? You can't. Sharon and I, when we made our prediction, we said, well, we're not even going to look at the charts because they're questionable. First of all, I can't use a chart. I don't have something that I'm comfortable with to use to say, well, I can make a prediction using that chart, because we have a birth certificate that says they were born at this time, we don't have that. We just, Trump, we did. But even that is so close to, like we talked earlier,
yeah,
is so close to it's only seconds away from moving into Virgo. And so you have to look at the astrology involved and techniques and traditional astrology on, okay, which is it, this or that. But anyway, I don't want to get into that discussion. The point I'm trying to make is the big difference between traditional and modern is just those two words, subjective, objective. That's the real difference. That's why you can have Saturn being a malefic. But also you have the astrologers who said, well, when Saturn is in a diurnal chart, he's oriental of the sun, he's in his domicile, and he has all these diurnal qualities, then he can do something good, okay? But as Abu Mashar really explains it, I just finished reading, on probably the third time I'm reading now, the greater introduction. He goes into a lot of explanation, about why a planet is malefic, and even a malefic planet says, well, it'll give you something good, but you're not going to like it, or there's always something negative about it. Even though it's a good thing, there's going to be some quality about it that you're not happy with. Maybe you don't get to keep it, but you have to give it away. Maybe, there's a lot of, so when you read these things, then you start understanding it's not just simply that a malefic in its sect is good. No. You can't, this is, even in traditional astrologers, this has become like, and then someday they look at a chart and it's not so good, and they say, that's not true what they said. But that's not exactly what they said or what they meant, right? Because they didn't write everything down. They didn't give us all their insights into things. Abu Mashar in the greater introduction goes into a lot of philosophy, I'm glad Ben is translating this, because I hear his introduction. I wrote him. I remember writing him when I got the book from, I bought it through Brill. I'd been saving for 10 years to buy this book. So that's the only reason I had money for that book, because it was really expensive. But I got Charles Burnett's translation and Keiji Yamamoto. And so I've been reading it, and there's just things in it that just blew me totally away, because he goes into a lot of detail about the philosophy of why a malefic is malefic. And that's something you don't get in any other author. And I understand why that book in particular was probably the most popular book of its time, okay? It was the first step of making astrology scientific, by the way. It really was.
Okay. Sure.
I can honestly say that. When there's some other questions you sent over to me, and I have to, when I get to those, I'll talk about that. But yeah, it's not just the techniques that separate traditional from modern. Modern astrologers, they'll look at the chart, and that's just an evolution of the person, right? You go to the first house is their inner personality. The second house is how they feel about money and what they think about. Third house is what they think about their brothers or sisters or siblings. Fourth house is what they think about their family, or they think about their mother. It's like an evolutionary cycle, a psychological evolution. if that even exists. But it's traditional astrology was there was one place that was the native, and that's the ascendant, right? There's one planet that actually is naturally signifies the native, and that's the moon, and the rest is all things happening to the native, which is when I live in my world, that's the way I experience the world. You know, the world's out there. I have brothers, I have sisters, I have mother, I have a father. Well, not anymore, they're passed away, but you know what I mean. We
Yeah.
have children, we have spouses, we have partners, or we have, you know, religion, or we have professions, and we have all of these things. But these are things happening in our life.
Sure.
I was reading, I'm writing a class on character delineation. We were talking about this a little earlier, you know, that, and it's not something that I would, you know, oh, well, that person's like this and that person's like that, you know. You have to know the person. You have to have a personal, intimate relation with the person in order to, it's like a doctor and a patient. They may not want to tell you that they have, you know, a venereal disease or something, because it might show negatively, you know. Have you been having a lot of extramarital relationships, and, you know, you get a venereal disease, and it can be awkward, right? Because there's a lot of personal information coming up.
Yes.
This is why there's a doctor-patient privilege, you know, it's confidential. So when I talk to my clients, that's the way it is. And they know they can open up to me, and they can be honest with me. And when they're honest with me, as I said to you earlier, that's when the chart really starts coming alive. Not just by what I perceive, you know, but when I start hearing it out of their own mouth, how they live life. And that's the difference. Objectivity, subjectivity.
Yeah.
So that's like traditionally, when you talk about transitioning from being a modern to a traditional astrologer, it's a big transition.
Yeah, I mean, it's about you know, giving up the subjective ideas which may tend to show up as realities, but the actual realities lie in objectivism, where we have to kind of, you know, and which gives us far more insight into actually experiencing life as it actually is.
Yes.
You know, that's what I feel. Maybe it's maybe it's like two traditional astrologers having a discussion about what is good in traditional astrology, but it's more about making transition from modern into traditional. So it makes it important for us to kind of touch upon these things, which are very, very essential components of both modern and traditional astrology. And what we feel about traditional astrology and modern astrology is certainly something that has to come out. So the idea of accepting the objective reality uh, leads us to the path of prediction. So as you were talking, once we look at a client's chart or a particular placement to see whether a particular planet is occidental or oriental, it does not talk much unless and until we have an actual insight into a person's life and see what the person is really experiencing. But I'm not sure, because see, the problem is I have very less exposure to modern astrology. So I've read like basically 3 books on modern astrology. But that also was after reading a little bit of traditional astrology works. So my first foray into Western astrology was traditional astrology. So, so
Well, I mean, I have a couple books down on my shelf. I was looking at my shelf down here, and I have I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 8 books there that are actually modern books, but I don't read them anymore. I was more of the what do you call it? I was more into the archetypical astrology and psychological, you know, Howard Sasportis.
okay.
These people, you know, that were very, I mean, of course, you have many astrologers who are along the same lines. And I had actually, my transition was not an easy transition, I'll be honest. It was not an honest, because I had, I really wasn't, I was reading more than I was practicing before in modern astrology, simply because I didn't know how to approach it. I mean, approaching a client in modern astrology is just nothing more than listening and counseling them through problems. Basically, that's what it's all about.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, any psychologist does the same thing. You know, if you can listen and allow the person just to talk, you know, then you just, you know, relating it to astrology was kind of a, you know, it's the whole reason that modern astrology got where it is simply because it's just, it wasn't scientific. If I be really honest, astrology was not viewed as something scientific. It still isn't viewed as something scientific.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're getting into the crux of the discussion here. So, yeah, traditional astrology, I mean, astrology was truly, you know, from the ancient times. So there's no point in, you know, calling traditional astrology was completely scientific. So astrology was accepted as a science during the ancient and medieval times. Only after some of the debacles in the Renaissance, astrology was kicked out from the mainstream scientific community. And earlier it was only due to the religious reasons, but I still doubt if astrology was actually not part of the society before Renaissance. It was pretty much part of the society before the Renaissance, despite some of the resistance shown by the Christian missionaries. But I don't have much knowledge about what Christian missionaries did to astrology during that time, except for, you know, but I'm not sure, but I still hear that there are many texts lying in Christian libraries, I mean, religious libraries as well. Yeah. So, yeah, so there is no point in kind of digressing into that. But the idea is like astrology was defended as science by Ptolemy, and later on, almost every astrologer tried to defend astrology as a scientific phenomenon. As you said, Abu Mashar, in his, I've not read the Great Introduction because I'm waiting for Ben's translation, and yeah, so.
Well, I can give you an example of how Abu Mashar did it. I mean,
okay.
He was talking about, actually, he was talking about Ptolemy. And he was talking about how the elements were assigned to the different planets. And he said, well, you know, the moon was said to be moist in this because it receives the vapors from the earth. But he said, the moon is 194,000 kilometers away from the earth. By that time, they could measure the different distance to the planets. He said, that's impossible. There was no vapors going up that high. So that's just, he said, I mean, it was really an interesting part of the book that I was thinking, wow, okay, he's really more relying on observation and scientific fact than he is on astrology here, right? And he gets into talking about, he says, we measure elements today because by what we see happens in the world, not by some kind of relationship between the planets. Very interesting points that Abu Mashar brings out, but it really pointed out to me that it was already at that time, there was this change to make astrology scientific. You have to remember, Abu Mashar, he came to Baghdad because he was a scholar with the Hadith. The Hadith was the sayings of Muhammad, right? And they had special people who were familiar with all of his writings that could distinguish between what was, you know, questionably not Muhammad and what they believed was Muhammad. That was what he was. He was trained in that his whole life. He was what, when he came, he was in his 30s when he came to Baghdad, or something, 29, something like this, when he came to Baghdad. He got there and he's this religious scholar. And he's faced with Al-Kindi, who is a philosophical scholar. Al-Kindi, he was fighting to translate all the Greek philosophical works like Aristotle, Plato, and all these, you know. And when Abu Mashar started getting in discussions with him, they were on two different. They were like talking above one to each other, you know,
Yeah.
because Al-Kindi was speaking in philosophical terms.
Yeah.
Abu Mashar is on religious terms, and that's why there was this friction between them. Not besides the fact that Abu Mashar was 9 years older than Al-Kindi, and in that kind of society where age made a difference. I mean, you respected age. You didn't, you know, speak against your elders in those societies, in that culture. And here he was having these arguments with Al-Kindi about these things. And so Abu Mashar realized, okay, I can't talk to him unless I understand what he's talking about. So he studied physics, he studied all the Greek philosophers, he studied mathematics, he studied astronomy, he studied all these things. And all of a sudden he starts presenting astrology as a science in scientific terms, probably the earliest form of scientific terms. But you already had this, and it's in the discussion we were going to have about house systems and things like this.
Yeah.
That in my opinion, okay, this is just my opinion. When I look at history and I look at the cultural events, then I see that events, it wasn't just Christianity that was the bane of astrology. I mean, the Islamic fundamentalists, the religious, what you would call them, Orthodox.
I mean, I think they banned it as calling astrology as a black magic or something.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, there was a big debate in Baghdad whether or not they could open a school to translate the Greek philosophies, simply because astrology was attached to it. That you couldn't separate the philosophy from astrology, right? They were the same, you know.
I mean, during those times, for sure, not possible.
So it's like there was a very heated debate in Baghdad. Again, the Orthodox Islamists said, no, we're not going to discuss this. It's anti-Quran, it's anti-Muhammad, it's, you know, we're not going to do it. And then you have people, well, yeah, and so they made a special niche, one special study group, you could call it, and they allowed them to do the translations. But it was it was supervised, it was watched. I mean, you had people watching over their shoulders all the time. So it was how they did it. This is in it, by the way, this is in a book that was written by, it's a biography of Al-Kindi, actually. And it talked about the work that he did and how the challenges he met and things like that. It's a very interesting book. I'll get the name of it, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
I can't remember it off the top of my head. But anyway, to say the least, it wasn't just Christianity that was a problem. Religion, Orthodox religion, let me put it like that, was a problem. Most Orthodox religions really look negatively on it. Now, I say that as a Christian myself, you know, and I've received all kinds of, you know, slanderous words from other Christians because I'm practicing. Every time I challenge them and say, well, you show me in the Bible verses where God hates astrology and I'll believe you. And they all end up going through, well, he didn't hate astrology, but he hated astrologers. I said, yes, why? Why did he have something against these astrologers? Well, because they were saying things contrary to what he was telling his prophets. That's why he didn't hate astrology. It wasn't like he was, but because it's like in modern times, you have people who are very biased. I was reading this chart of Constantine for last one. Levante.
Yeah.
He translated, so I was reading it. And these guys, even in that time, were politically biased. There's nothing in the delineation of the chart that's right. Everything is absolutely wrong. When you look at Constantine's, his life history and all the predictions this guy made were totally wrong. There's just nothing that even agreed. But it was because here he was, this guy who was in the court that had to follow very closely. He was being watched by religious people. So he had to be careful about what he said. He couldn't just say anything, you know, and he's saying it about the king as well. So it was very interesting to read that chart because it really gave you an insight that the only astrologer I really saw that I've even read that dared gainsay his the Sultan or the Caliph of his time was Abu Mashar. He was whipped for it. In fact, at one time he was put in prison, and the Caliph told him, if this prediction does not come true, you die tomorrow. I mean, that's having your life put on the line.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a story by Shadan, you know, he's recounting these stories. So, the cancel culture was alive and well in those days as well. Let me tell you, when you got canceled, you got canceled, you know. If you said something that was not politically correct, then watch yourself. That's been around for centuries. You know, it's nothing new in that. But my point in all this is that astrology made between tradition has been, dare I say, compromised by science, by trying to make it scientific. I don't think astrology is, I mean, I have 2 degrees in a scientific, you know, they're in engineering, system engineering and structural engineering. So I've studied science. It's my major was science. So
Sure.
I understand when they say, "What you know, show me empirical evidence." You know, I know what they're talking about. Using the scientific method to come to some kind of conclusion. And if your conclusion doesn't fit your hypothesis, then you have to go back and reword your hypothesis and you start all over again. The scientific method, it's based on observation and experience. You know, that's what scientific method is based on. And how do you do that with astrology? How do you base it on empirical evidence? You cannot. If you talk about in our art, if you say, well, what is the signification of the profession? Well, let's take that for an example. What do they say to look at? Well, you look at Mercury, Mars, and Venus. That was something that you would look at. You would look at the 10th house, its ruler. That's another thing you would look at. You would look at the lot of professions, the lot of work, and its lord. That's another signification. You would look at, for example, in a diurnal chart, you would look at the new moon prior to the chart, the pre-ingress lunation, which is new moon.
Prenatal
Look to see what planet the moon was joining in that, and that would be an indication as to which of the planets was going to be a professional significator. And so it's like you had at least 6 or 7 different techniques. So if I'm going to do a statistical analysis to find empirical evidence, you have to know every one of these techniques and list all the different charts which have these techniques in them. And I mean, the variables become, it's like, okay, I'm not even going to try. So when I see people doing this, well, I've statistically examined, 1,500 charts. Well, okay, for my first question, who checked to make sure all the charts were correct? 2, you used a house system. How do you know the house system is right? 3, I can go through and I can be critical of any analytical examination. So I quit trying to analyze astrology. For me, it became, because I work with mathematics all the time, it was my minor in university is mathematics. So, mathematics is nothing more than a way to quantify and qualify physical things, our physical world. I use it all the time in my profession as an engineer. And to me, astrology became nothing more than a conceptual language.
Mm.
Okay? If it's a conceptual language, then it was based on all these people's teachings, okay? Ancient teachings. And this language was created. This conceptual language was created. It doesn't matter if I'm using a tropical zodiac or a sidereal zodiac, because the conception was built around a specific zodiac. in Vedic astrology, your astrology, your conception, your conceptual language is based around a sidereal chart. That's what it's based on.
Yes.
So in Western, or I should say our Western astrology, was based on the idea that in order to measure, how do you measure time, things happening in life, was by the change that things went through. That's how they measured time. That was their philosophical discussion of, change. Well, our time, it was things that changed. That's why there became time lords, because they were in periods that showed change. Okay, so change was the whole, and that's what was based on what? It was based on the seasons. It was based on the sun going through the signs, and they saw the changes around them happening all the time. So the tropical question was on that. That's what it was built on, that conceptual language. So when I'm doing Persian astrology or Hellenistic Persian, I do kind of a symbiosis of Hellenistic and Persian astrology. That it was based on that philosophy. There was a real distinct conception to the language, okay? Which is why Ptolemy, he was the first one to try to put everything into a scientific category. I was doing a recent study, and I'm writing on it right now, about perfections. We were talking about monthly perfections especially, but I was studying about perfections, and I read in Vicious Valens, and he got from the Chepso, it's actually a lot. It's not, you calculate the transiting sun to the sun at the revolution of the year, and you cast it out from the natal sun, transiting sun to the natal sun, and cast it out from the sign of the year, the perfected sign of the year. Okay, that was the lot, and that's how it was described in Vicious Valens. Ptolemy, and this is I suspect that he had the same text, and he calculated it. And it just goes month by month. So he said, "Well, we just perfect month by month."
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So the logic is the same, but the technique is very different. What they were doing, what Vicious Valens was doing, was extremely different from Ptolemy's trying to put it into terms that make sense. So he wouldn't even discuss the other lots. Ptolemy hated lots. He only discussed the lot of fortune because he noticed that in a diurnal, whenever you use the diurnal fortune, it didn't matter which chart you used it in, that the distance of the sun from the ascendant was the same as the moon from the lot of fortune. So he called it the ascendant of the moon, or the lot of fortune was the ascendant. But that was his basis for keeping the lot of fortune. Okay, he ignored all the practice that was being done in order to make it his scientific equivalent to fit his science. And he says it in the chapter on, I think it's in the first book when he's talking. I think it's chapter 28, towards the end of that book, when he mentions that well, we're not going to talk about these things because there's no basis in science for them. It was the 12th parts and the lots and all these things that he just ignored them because they didn't fit his scientific criteria. And that's bias. I mean, right there, you got bias right there, big bias. And so this is the problem. And I mean, when you start mixing science with astrology, you start compromising the astrology.
Sure. Yeah. See, I think personal bias or prejudice plays a major role in almost every field, and not just astrology. And I think that also leads us to the next step of our discussion. I mean, capitalizing on what we already spoke about, subjective and objective reality. So the idea of being objective kind of lends to prediction, but subjective does not really lean towards prediction, and it kind of throws light into a whole lot of things which might necessarily be good or bad.
Potential.
Yeah, so yeah, potential, or I mean, Saturn return is termed as a stepping stone to the next part of the life by modern astrologers, but traditional astrologers use Saturn return less, but they might not necessarily term Saturn return as a stepping stone. Of course, there is a turn in everyone's life, and it might be Saturn return, or it might necessarily not be Saturn return. So it's about, so objective reality directly extends to the next step, which is prediction. And prediction means the person who's just sitting opposite to us should be ready to hear the truth and not hear what they want to hear. So that's the biggest problem that we as astrologers making a transition from modern to traditional need to, accustom to, because we always hear good things what we want to hear. So we don't want to hear negative things. As a human, it is it's our nature to kind of lend our ears to good things and not the bad things. So no one wants to hear what Saturn has to do, but everyone wants to hear what Venus or Jupiter wants to do. So
Yes.
so it's, I think the natural instinct, human instinct of succumbing to all the good things is probably one of those areas that we might have to shade with gray and just move on and look at what the actual reality, the objective reality in life is through predictions. And for predictions we need techniques, and one of those techniques, techniques are time law techniques or your house systems. So we can broadly classify them into two or three areas, where one is the techniques that we use to construct a chart, and next is techniques that we use to kind of time the events in a person's life. But in order to time the events, we need to sit with a person and have an understanding about what the subjective idea of a specific chart is there, and then kind of move on to the other part to make predictions. So you need to understand the person very well. So it's not that modern astrology is not useful, but character analysis comes as one area of understanding the client. But apart from that, opening the doors to reality is an entirely different thing, and character is left behind by a long way in that case. So that's one thing that, that's again my notion of thinking. So people are welcome to criticize if they don't agree with this, but this is how I see. So if and there are modern astrologers who are predictive as well. So it's also not fair to kind of classify modern astrology as non-predictive and traditional astrology as predictive. So there are pure modern astrologers who tend to be predictive. So prediction is all about being open to the truth. So the point is, I might not say necessarily that what my client has to hear. So, but I won't answer any question that is not being posed to me. So I answer only the question that my client asks, but I give a very objective answer, which might not be necessarily favorable to him or not necessarily that he wants to hear. So just because the client does not want to hear the negative thing, I cannot kind of, it's basically fooling someone who is sitting in front of me, paying some dollars for the service that I'm providing. At the end of the day, I should at least say some truth to what is actually there. So I think that's one of the important and richest things that traditional astrology will offer, as far as I study traditional astrology goes. So, and I also have a background of predictive astrology, so it's not new to me. And Martin Ganshin mentioned in his interview with Chris Brennan that the first thing that Indian people come to astrologer and ask is that they want to know about the longevity. So they're ready to hear, if they're ready to hear, as long as, even if it is death, they're ready to hear. So it doesn't matter. I mean, the question is when, but they want to know when. So there are people who are curious about, they want to know when.
That's a culture too, right? In India,
Yes, exactly.
life and death is just an everyday experience. I mean,
Yeah.
people experience it. It's not pleasant. I'm not saying it's pleasant.
Yeah.
At the same time,
It's exactly like what you explained about the teen girl that you talked about earlier in our discussion. It is obviously traumatic, but it's about how we kind of lift it and what we kind of, I mean, just turning the situation into our benefit, as a perfect stoic would do, which is what you said. So yeah.
So it's like these kind of things. Well, as you know, I don't know. I just recently put an article on my website about,
Yes.
it was the teacher's thoughts on longevity. Okay, in Western society, okay, I've lived in, like as I said, I've lived in Africa, Middle East, India, Nepal. I've lived in a lot of non-Western countries. I've lived in cultures where death is like an everyday experience. It's like, me changing my pants that day, that it's that common. It's a common thing. But in the West, there's this, oh, about death. I mean, the whole idea around it is become taboo. They hide it. They put it away. They don't want people to have to think about death, but it's a part of our life. I mean, there's if there's anything in your life that I can guarantee, I will bet you $1 million you're going to die one day.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, come on. It's like, that is the most absurd. But then again, when I have a client before me, I'm not calloused. I'm not uncaring. I have to take those cultural things into consideration. That doesn't mean I'm going to say, well, you might die or anything like this. I say, well, if I do a longevity for somebody and they're asking me, first of all, I don't just volunteer it unless it's something that's a question in their mind, then I'll discuss it with them. If they come to me with that as a question, am I going to get sick? And I'll say, well, I see, I looked at your longevity, and as far as I can see, there's no events in the near future that indicate any kind of crisis, health crisis. I might say it like that.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily, well, you're only going to live 87 years and then you're going to die, And if somebody does ask me and I do give them a figure, I'll say, well, it's like, first I explain, I did my own longevity. And mine showed that it would run out in my 60th year. Okay, I'm 70 now, just in case. And in my 60th year, I had a massive heart attack. And
nearly death-like experience.
Yes, and so the doctor, the heart specialist, who's the main doctor at the hospital, he said, if this would have been 10 years ago, you more likely would have died. He said, with the technology we have now, no, we can extend your life a period of time, right? Which made me think, I mean, there was this, in longevity, they talked about, well, if you had Venus or Jupiter in the ascendant or the midheaven, then it could extend your life. It extended the length of years. And I had Jupiter in the 10,000. I thought, wow, that's interesting. It's like an angel sitting at the top saying, okay, well, this is going to happen. But it aspects my ascendant as well. So it's like, what should I say about these things? How specific can we say? I can point, so I usually, when I'm speaking to a client, I'll say, well, I see a crisis, a health crisis at this point of life. Robert Zoller talked about this in his class. He made a special point out of it because he said, well, if you look at my chart, I shouldn't have been alive, If you judged it by the standards that the ancients judged things, then why am I alive, And he said, simply because, well, we have medical science today. You know, it extends life, extends, we get a guarantee.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of look at what were they trying to say. In those days, yeah, most likely you would have died from
For
most of these
sure.
things.
I mean, a lot depends on the context of life that we are living in a current situation. What probably was probably a deathly scenario in the second century when Valence was writing. It's probably a nothing scenario today, and yeah, exactly. And it reminds me of this another interesting story that we had seen personally or witnessed personally, where my grandfather had predicted that I might pass away today, and he was sitting inside his home, and just the next day he had a massive heart attack, and he was rushed to the hospital. This was in 2009, and he had a
That's when I had mine too.
okay. I mean, looks like it was a bypass here. So he had a heart bypass surgery, and he's 82 now, and he's still he's not very strong, but still he's doing well. So
Well, that's what they wanted to do with me. Triple bypass. They told me in the hospital, we're going to do triple bypass. And I was very fortunate because at the time I was smoking. That happened for people. That happened. And I had 3 blood vessels that were collapsed and very near to the heart. So the prognosis was, well, we have to operate, we have to go in, we have to, replace those. And then I went home, I stopped smoking for, it was like 8 weeks before I was scheduled to go in for my surgery. And during that 8 weeks, I didn't smoke. I had nothing. I changed, repented of my evil ways, and I started doing things the right way. And I went in, and they go in and they take new pictures because they don't want to operate without having the most recent pictures.
Yeah.
And the doctor said, "Wow, I can come to them now, and we're just going to put these stents in your blood vessels where they were collapsed. They're just like these little cylinders they put in to keep the blood vessel open so they don't collapse anymore." Took 1 hour. I was finished. No surgery, nothing. So, and the doctor, he came in afterwards. He said, "Wow," he said, "you told me you were going to stop smoking." He said, "But I didn't believe you because everybody says the same thing when they come in and they're faced in a crisis." He says, "I've heard this so many times, but obviously you did it because when we looked, there was such an improvement in the blood vessels that we could now just do this." So it's kind of like, it was like my reward for taking that step to make my body whole.
Yeah, sure.
But this is just an example. The reason I say it is because, well, we tend to look at longevity if I was in Africa, I would look at it differently if a client came to me, because they don't have the same medical facilities, they don't have the same health systems, they don't have, if I was, if you just look at the differences in how under this coronavirus things were handled in Italy and things were handled in Norway, for example. If I look at the 2 differences, the health systems in both, their health system was overwhelmed and Norway's wasn't, and they were able to get the patients in and out, they handled it a little bit different. So it's like there's a lot of things that, like I said at the beginning, when Abu Mashar was telling Shadan, explaining this longevity to him, and he said, "Well, did you look at how long did his father live? How long did his mother live? How long did his grand?" It's the same kind of consideration, well, what is the culture I'm living in? What is, what are the chances if a crisis were to happen, that this person would be able to be helped, All these things are real, and they're objective, they're not just my subjective opinion. If I just held myself, and I guess this is something a lot of people, when they read something and they don't try to understand why the person was saying it. This is something else. Understanding what was behind that person's saying, well, this combination with this combination means that this, what was the reason for it? Is there must be a conceptual reason behind it. And I guess this has to do with the transition between In modern astrology, we don't look at things like that. We don't take it. We just look at the person instead of looking at the culture and society. How do they live? Are they wealthy? Are they poor? Are they middle class? Are they very wealthy? Because I mean, all these things bring certain, I hate to say privilege. I hate that word. It's not a privilege, but it is a status that gives a little bit more when you're in that status. You have access to more because you have the finances for more, and you probably are living in a place where there is that kind of help to be had. So it's like all these things are a part of our astrology. It's a part of my traditional astrology. You couldn't get anybody more traditional than myself. I don't think it's possible. But at the same time, I'm very objective, and I look at the person. In modern astrology makes this big deal about free will, making choices. And prediction is just contrary to that. But it's not contrary, because when I make a prediction, I am taking their choices into consideration, because that's why I do a character analysis. I want to see what they're predisposed to choose. This was the whole idea behind Robert Zoller when he wrote his thing on primary motivation. It was not to do a psychological evaluation of the guy and say, well, but it was to understand, why do I choose? Why is it that in my life, I've chosen these relationships that I've chosen? Even though they both were a total failure, at the end of things, they were good. They produced, I have 12 children. I have, happy children. And, I'm close to all of them, and I'm even close to my ex-wives. We're friends. It's not. It just came to naught. And I have the ruler of the ascendant in that house. That's where I was directing trying to find happiness. So yeah, those things are real. But when you start becoming self-aware, okay, why did I make that choice? It's not a mental change that happens. It's a change in what I do that happens. Well, I'm not going to make that choice anymore, right? I stop doing something, or I do something instead. And this is how you help people, because maybe their ruler's in a bad shape, and they're making bad choices. But you say, well, here, look at the triplicity lord of the ascendant. Look at it. It's up here. It's in this house, and it has potential. You can find happiness here. It won't be this big happiness that you're trying to achieve, but you can find contentment. You can find this, So you help the person to direct them there. They become self-aware. First of all, why am I choosing all these things and they're turning out bad? You make them self-aware of something, and then you direct them into the direction that probably is going to give them the best advantage in life. Sure. That's how I use that, and you use it in profession. You delineate. Well, there's so many professions that have to do with Venus being aspected by Mercury. I mean, yes. there's how do you distinguish what profession, right? The distinguishing happens because of the person's character and culture and all these society and all these things start getting rid of all this other stuff and start focusing on things that actually matter. So it's all relevant. It's all objective evaluations. Okay, so that's the difference in my big difference between modern astrology and traditional astrology. It's not just the predicting. I've gotten predictions wrong.
Yeah,
they're not all
everyone is human, so
I misunderstand things, and I see things in chart, or I become biased in my evaluation. I don't want to. I've had this happen. I like this person. I really don't want to give them bad news, so I try to sugarcoat it, right? And I make it wrong, and you do things wrong instead of being honest and saying, well, I would like to say this, but unfortunately I cannot say this. And it doesn't mean that I don't like you or I love you. I think that you're a great person, you know, and I hate to see people go through bad things, but you can expect this, you know, that's different. You know, it's like you care for somebody. People seem to think that if you care for somebody, you're never going to tell them anything bad. And this is just if I find it a curse in our society today, because I would rather somebody be brutally honest with me. I may get mad and say, oh, but the truth is the truth, and it's better to have the truth and to be able to change and do something about it than to just go along and think, well, this is the status quo and it's okay, and then be disappointed all the time. You know, it's like, what do I want? You know, and what do I want to give other people? I know what I want to give people what I myself would expect. You know, so. So that is a lot about dealing with predictive sides of astrology.
I mean, it's about being ready to hear the truth, even if it is bad. So, yeah.
You have to. I mean, it's telling the truth in love. I mean, if you really care for somebody, you know, I've seen people be hard and callous because I remember I've had 12 kids, so it wasn't always easy for me to sit down with my kids and correct them. That's the hardest thing to do. You don't want to correct them. You don't want to do things that make them become self-aware and change what they're doing, change behavior. But it's something that a parent has to do. And you become unpopular, you become, you know, they might get mad at you and, you know, they think you're the worst daddy in the world. And, you know, it's like, oh God, his dad doesn't do that, you know, and it's like, his dad would never say it. And then, but later, okay, I see the fruits now. Every one of my kids come to me for counsel because they know they're going to get truth. The real counsel from them. They know I'm going to give them truth. I'm not going, and they know I love them because I've always been there in their lives. Whenever there was a crisis, whenever they needed help, I was always there to give support, to do whatever I had, you know, could do as a parent, you know, to help them through it. This is how we have to be with people. You know, you have to be that way, and just to be real with people and to have an open and desire to want to help them, you know.
I'm very glad that you mentioned this because I just think it was important. It kind of has some kind of an impact in me after hearing it, but it's important to kind of be there for people by saying the truth instead of just sugarcoating and moving away. I don't mean to say that astrologers move away after saying things, but it's important to be playing the role of an astrologer, and it should be fitting to the situation, and it should help the person as much as possible. So I think we can make a transition in our discussion to dealing with techniques and timing events, such as, I think the first problem that arises is house systems.
We're going to go there.
I hate to go there, but
you have to. When you talk about, anytime you talk about prediction, you have to go to house systems.
Yeah, so it's important for us to kind of address this because some of the traditional astrologers use quadrant house systems as well, and they have not implemented whole sign systems in their practice. So it's not about what's correct and what's wrong, but more traditional astrologers, and especially in Hellenistic astrology, I think whole sign houses was the most used house system across all the texts, unless and until before we reached 7th century texts or 8th century texts, we did not have much of quadrant systems except for a few reasons. But for topics of life, I think whole sign system fits the best, and that's where we can see the results as much as possible. So,
the Horoi project by Levente. What he is doing is so valuable. I can't even begin to express my gratitude that he's doing the work that he's doing, because he is actually presenting the charts, right?
Yes.
Of astrologers that were practicing in the 8th, 9th century, and in the Byzantine,
Yeah.
especially in Byzantine astrology. And all of those charts that he's presented so far were using Vicious Valence porphyry houses.
Mm-hmm.
Every one of them. And you don't find the division of the quadrants using the equator, but you instead from the midheaven to the ascendant, and then dividing the ecliptic into
Definitely.
things.
Yeah.
That's what was used. 8th, 9th century in Byzantine, that was the most popular. It apparently, to me, it seems that was very popular at the time, at least from the charts I've seen that he's translated so far, which was kind of an eye-opener for me, because I figured by this time they're doing something else, but because Abu Mashar talks about the time, and they were starting to, because of the scientific advancements in Islamic empire, okay, under they were able to what is the word I'm looking in English? They were able to put together a system of spherical geometry, which was non-existent before that. You had some of the things in Indian mathematics, you had some things in Babylonian mathematics, but they took everything together and they systemized it. They put it into a very clear use for spherical geometry and trigonometry and things like this. So for the first time, you had them dividing the equator, right? In order to transpose the divisions of the equator, where the midheaven, actually they were using the equator to calculate the ascendant, and everything was measured in either right ascension or oblique ascensions. So that was the measure for them. So now they were dividing that and then transposing everything onto the ecliptic in very general terms. That's what they were doing. But there's also a side of Western astrology that those two things were quite separate in their conceptions. The equator was what made diurnal motion. It's what the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, it was the measure of time. And this is in Ptolemy quite clearly, that, well, you had the positions of the planets on the ecliptic, he says, their work, their actions are on the ecliptic. This is repeated again and again throughout the Persian area. And they had a correlating degree on the ecliptic, which measured time. So when people started, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. So when people started making divisions on the ecliptic, actually what they're doing is dividing space by time.
Sure.
Why? And my big question from that, well, why do we do that? I remember sending you a message and asking, in Vedic astrology, do they do this? We don't. I mean, there are some that do it today. It's very modern, but it's not a general practice in Vedic astrology.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Historically, I think 15th century or 16th century, after the advent of Persian astrology, after the entry of Persian astrology into India, I think divisions became far more prominent, but it's not very widely used except for a few specific set of astrologers that practice that particular form of astrology.
Yes. So for me, I understand the reason why Vicious Valence talks about it at all was because he wanted to know the strength that the planets had in a certain place, whether they were advancing matters or whether they were stopping matters. That was the reason for it. And it was used specifically in his length of life, talking about finding the predominator and the house lord, house master, and things like this, and being in a strong place. Yeah, I mean, since beginning, there's been another division. Okay.
Yes.
In Western astrology, since the beginning, there's been other divisions. you can't say it's unique to the Persians or anything else. It's not. For me, when I consider it, and I consider it from the conceptual language perspective, I find it contrary. I find it contrary to the conception because, well, they made a very clear conception of the equator being a measurement of time, being that circle that was going to measure time, and the ecliptic as being the place where all the action is happening. You know, it's the center of the world, you know, where the action of the planets were actually happening, you know.
Yeah.
So that's two very separate conceptions. And all of a sudden we're conflating them. We're kind of throwing them together in a mix and saying, well, we'll divide here and put it all on the ecliptic, and therefore it's a better system. I use only whole sign. I've gotten to that point where I don't use any other. I note where the house cups would fall if I used a porphyry, and I use porphyry division on it. Because that's dividing the ecliptic and not the equator. And I know, well, okay, planets falling, for example, I know things are in the first house, but if it's falling away from the ascendant or advancing from the ascendant, okay, I keep my language very precise when I'm dealing with these things, so that I don't conflate things, because when we're talking about the first house, we're talking about the first sign. Okay? Everything that's the first sign is the house.
Yeah. So, I mean, since Vedic astrology predominantly follows only whole sign systems, I did not have a chance to work with quadrant house system at all. So only after getting exposed to Western astrology, I had this little bit of, experience trying to work with quadrant house systems, but the problem that I had, the reason why I cannot comment on whether to use whole signs or quadrant house systems, and I have to rely upon how quadrants work based upon others, I mean the other astrologers' experiences, precisely because that I have not worked much with quadrant house systems. But the reason why I'm sticking to whole sign house systems is because that I cannot live with the fact that a house is not equal to a sign.
Yeah.
It's really terrifying to me, where we have two houses in one sign, and this interceptors and all those things are really complicated to me. So I don't want to put myself through those kind of troubles. So it was easier for me to stick to house is equal to sign idea.
Well, that's just a very minor problem. I mean, you have other problems. I mean, if you're going to use a quadrant system, how do you say that a planet, for example, is in the 8th house? The 8th house was an evil house because it fell in aversion to the ascendant, right? They didn't see each other. But if you say it's in the 8th house, but I'm in the 9th sign.
I mean,
it's like suddenly, well, it's not an evil house then, okay?
Yeah.
Are you saying that the 8th house is not evil? Because it's in the 8th house. If I was using divisions, it's in an 8th house, but it's in the 9th sign. I had a problem with my own chart like this, and I didn't like it. I thought, well, this doesn't, just none of it makes sense. None of it. Even Abu Mashar, and I remember Ben really talking about this, that Abu Mashar had to do a lot of dance steps when dealing with perfections, whether or not to perfect from the cusp or from the sign, and he did both. But if there was a question, he fell to doing it from the cusps. You see this transition occurring because there was a lot of things that were contrary to the conceptual language. I mean, the whole purpose, I mean, a planet falling in aversion, not seeing the ascendant, was a serious thing, you know? From Hellenistic, even through Persian times, they talk about it again and again and again, or a planet falling in aversion to its own domicile, you know? How can it be in the 7th sign, but it be in the 7th house and be in the 8th sign and doesn't see its house? You know,
and again, there is another problem.
it makes more problems than solves, to put
Yeah.
it like this. And I've seen people try to use both. I tried for a while because Robert Zoller, at the time I was taking his course, he was making a transition himself to whole science because he had been working with Project Hindsight. So all this evidence was coming out, the whole sign. And I remember asking him specifically, I said, well, I have Mars in the 9th sign, but it falls in the 8th house. He said, well, it's in both. I said, how can it be in both? I mean, it's, you know, Vicious Valens does a little bit of the same dance step in book 9 of his anthology, when he's talking about the midheaven falling in the 9th house. He said, well, it's both. You know, it's a 9th and it's a 10th, you know. Yeah. So when I listened to Chris Brennan's, he had a podcast on the theory, the conception behind the house systems and things like this. And it's very, I liked the way he presented it. It was very informative. And it helped me to kind of get a clear, the midheaven, actually, if you call the MC, is just the highest point that the planets are going to be in the chart. But they're not the highest point in the chart.
Yeah, this is something that Anthony Lewis addressed in one of the videos that I did with him in terms of addressing the nonagesimals and midheaven. So I think we just went a bit more deeper in this topic to deal with divisions of houses and quadrants of houses.
Very simply, I use whole science. It's very good. I have no problems with it. My clients are happy with my delineations, and I don't sit with a lot of confusion. You know, I don't have that confusion.
Sure. So that's something that we addressed. I mean, we are not giving direct answers, but it's all about seeing what works from a traditional point of view, which might probably help a modern astrologer make a transition. So
I know you and we talk a lot together because you will post a chart, and it's always with sidereal.
Yeah.
And what I like to do is I like to look at the same chart in tropical.
Tropical, I know.
with my conceptual language, not with your conceptual.
Sure.
And I remember talking to you about it, and they say the same thing.
Yes.
It's just that what makes them say the same thing is your conceptual language says that, and my conceptual language says this. Yeah. So the whole sidereal question as well, should I use tropical? Well, what astrology do you practice? You know, do you practice Vedic astrology? Use sidereal, because that's what their language is all about. You know, that's how they describe the actions. It's not based on the same conceptions that Western astrology is. So it's very simple. You know, for me, it's simple. For a lot of people, they choke on it. I'll get a lot of arguments. People get really angry and want to talk about, well, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to discuss it. I mean, why?
I don't think there is a point in discussing about the debate of tropical versus sidereal astrology.
It's not even that. The house division question is the same. I put it in the same category. And what do you use? I use whole science.
Sure. That's simple.
And it's very simple, you know, and I have no problems delineating charts. And and I use Persian astrology. It has the Hellenistic model in it, but I also, some things that I carried in from Hellenistic astrology that were dropped in Persian astrology. Let's put it like this. Combustion and things like that, had to deal with that. And I don't look at it the same way. I mean, I think the Hellenistic astrologers, although I've read Persian astrologers get very irate about thinking about it. It's not combust. Well, I had Persian astrologers like Masha Allah that talked about in his writing, when he was writing about longevity, he said, well, if a planet is, which is the house master, is with the sun in the same, but the sun receives it in that sign, it's not hurt. It's not combust. Okay, there's a mitigation for combustion right there. and it's coming out of a Persian's mouth, you know. So it's like, you know, this was something they taught. So it's not that big of a stretch for me to say that if a planet is in its chariot, as Ptolemy would say, or, I mean, they each had a little different criteria for it, so it's hard to understand that. But if it's in it, some kind of, it has a share in the sign and it's combust, well, it's not harmed, you know. So what I have, you know, I have Mercury in my chart. People would say it's combust because it's only 2 degrees from the sun, leaving the sun.
Okay.
Everybody would say it's combust, right? I have no problems with mathematics, and I have no problems with science, and I have no problems with it. It's in its own terms. It's in its own balance. So according to Hellenistic astrology, it wasn't burnt up. It wasn't destroyed. It could signify, right? So when I look at my life and you think about, okay, mental qualities, that's what Mercury's all about. You know, I don't stutter and stammer, and I don't, you know, I speak 7 different languages. So is my Mercury inhibited?
No.
Somebody have to, you know, show me the astrology that says it is, you know. I'm sorry. Most people would say, yes, it's combust.
And one more thing is that it's always the condition of Mercury. Mercury is always close to the sun. So
Yes.
yeah, I also kind of have this. I don't know how to. I mean, ambiguity on whether to use combustion or not. I don't give much. You know, see, if it is with other planets, that's maybe we have to take a look at it. But if it is Mercury, I don't think so, because that's usually the condition.
I have Venus combust also. I mean, my Venus is also 2 degrees from. They're both 2 degrees from the sun, one on one side, one on the other side. Venus is moving into the sun. Mercury is moving away from the sun.
And even more,
Even in Persian astrology, they had 2 very different significations and ways of looking at it. It was like looking the same way that they looked at the first station, right? That was a real bad place. When the planet first comes to its station and it's going to go retrograde, that was really bad. Okay.
Sure.
But when it came to its second station and was getting ready to go, you know, then it had more positive, you know, delineations. And, you know, it was a promise of more better things. It was like, I think Lily said it's like a person who's well, who's getting up and out of bed now, so he's well. So it's the same thing with combustion. You had the Persians, when they looked at a planet that was running under the beams, when it first, from the heliacal setting, as it was approaching the sun, that was bad. But as soon as it left and it was approaching its heliacal rising, they said, even if it's 7 days from the heliacal rising, that's a portent of something very good. Okay, they looked at it like it had already risen out of the sunbeams. So they didn't put combustion either into a box, you know, that's square and, you know, it's only this and cast in stone, you know, let's chisel it here. But so doing a lot of charts for people has made me realize that, well, actually it's very true. I find more negative delineation of a planet that's going under the beams than one coming out. Okay. I find the ones coming out tend to be the delineation, and their delineation and signification in the chart is much more precise, it's much more obvious, it's effective, things like this. So combustion with me is all these issues, you know, they're issues that we read, right? Because they come up because people have read it and they have their stone tablet like the 10 Commandments, and they chiseled it into the stone. That's what it says, therefore that's what I'm going to do, you know. You have a lot of opinion from different astrologers.
Sure. Yeah.
And you had a lot of delineation. And I know Bonatti addressed this at one point, saying, well, the ancients there was disputation, but there were no differences in there. It's like today we have this, I say it's our society has become so that if you disagree or if you have a fact that might be a little bit different, then all of a sudden it's that point of dissension, okay? You can't agree on things. But if you look at it and say, well, it could be this and this, it doesn't have to be this or this. But what if it's this under this situation and this under this situation? So these are the nuances of trying to be objective about things and to look at the reasons why people say they did and understanding the reasoning behind what they said, okay? That's also, which is why this book by Abu Mashar, I mean, I think when Ben releases it, I hope it's going to be very popular because the philosophy in it was what is really important. Because Abu Mashar spells out his philosophy crystal clear. You know, it's very Aristotelian, very scientific. He puts everything in a scientific. I mean, no, the moon can't have vapors from the earth because it's too far away. Simple. I mean, and it's a truth. It's a truth. So it was a step towards scientificism, you know, being scientific. It's the what they call the scientific method today. You know, it's you make if I can be so bold to say that, okay, I have a glass of milk, I leave it out on the counter. During the night, there's a thunderstorm. The next morning, I go in and I see that the milk is now curdled. It's gone sour. Well, there was thunder and milk. Okay, there must be a correlation between the two. That's what modern astrology does very often, which is why they still use the outer planets. You know, they make this haphazard, you know, correlation between an event or a series of events and this planet that just happened to be there, you know?
So I think you just naturally took the discussion to the outer planets, which we were obviously going to address next.
So, I don't use them. It's just so everybody knows, I only use the 7 traditional planets. That's all I've ever used. And I made plenty of predictions, both mundane predictions, predicted the Croatian elections, I predicted Brexit, I predicted the elections recently in Britain, I predicted the last election in America. I predicted the outcome of the American invasion into Iraq. I have predicted so many, and that prediction alone, I got letters from people like Lee Lehman who wrote me and said, wow, that was really heavy. You know, okay, thank you, I appreciate it. But it's just the astrology, you know, I'm just repeating the astrology. That's all that's being there. But none of it is really, I never use outer planets. Why can I come to the conclusions I do and I don't use the outer planets? I find that, I mean, think about it. Uranus takes 84 years to go through 12 signs. 84 years. That means it's in a sign for 7 years. That means it moves 1 degree every 2.8 months. So that's not a measurement of change. That's real stability. And it gets even worse with Neptune. I mean, Neptune has a cycle of 163 years to go in this through all the signs. I mean, you and me aren't even going to live that long. So how can you say it does this? What empirical evidence? Well, you say, well, I can look at all the charts. Yeah, but I can look at the charts and I see, for example, if you're talking about war, the signification of war, it's not just Mars. Mars was not the only signification of war. Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, Saturn, Venus rising Oriental in the chart. There's a lot of indications for aggression and violence and things like this that were used by the ancients. I mean, it wasn't just one thing. Again, we come to that. And now they're trying to put everything under the, you know, all change in science is ruled by Uranus because, you know, it rules Aquarius. Well, no, it doesn't rule Aquarius, sorry. never did. Even that was disputed between the first Raphael and Zadkiel. He said, no, I don't accept that. But then the second Raphael, he came along and said, yeah, it is. It's like, I like it, so I think I'm going to do it. I like it. It's my order. So, and the reason he came to it is because, well, Mercury ruled Virgo, Venus ruled Libra, Mars ruled Scorpio, Jupiter ruled Saturn, ruled Sagittarius, Saturn ruled Capricorn. So of course the new planet's going to rule Aquarius. That's how he came to it. That's how he came to it. So simplistic, and without any kind of philosophical reasoning behind it. Nothing that, I'm sorry. It's a discussion that I think I've heard people say, well, you can observe Uranus. I said, well, if you could observe it, why didn't they report on it for the last 2,500 years or 3,000 years since they've been observing the stars? Even the Arabs had telescopes. I'm sorry, they did. They had. Yeah. The only difference was Galileo put a movable eyepiece on his, so he could focus longer. That's all. That's the only change that was made to a telescope. Right? Telescopes were there. The Arabs had, the Persians had them mounted on top of their towers, and they were observing the stars. And not one of them talks about Uranus. I'm sorry, because it only moves 1 degree in 2.8 months. So that means you can sit there and look at it for 2.8 months, and it's not going to even, and even when it moves a degree,
it's not recognizable.
You're not going to even be noticing it, right? So why would they notice them? Why would it take, it's not, and it isn't just the visibility thing. I think that's kind of an easy excuse to say, well, they didn't use them because they were not visible. That's true. They weren't visible, and not even Uranus is visible. You go out tonight and tell me where Uranus is without looking at an ephemeris. You go out and pick it out for me. Okay. If it happens to be next to another star, for example, that's brighter than it, you'll never see it. If it happens to be, in a cluster of stars, you'll never see it. It's too faint. Okay. I've tried many times to go out and just walk out the door and find Uranus. You can't. You can't distinguish it. You can't unless you know what you're looking for. Of course, people who say, well, I can go out and look. Yeah, if you look at your chart and you look at the ephemeris and say, okay, it's here and here and here, then you go out and you can find it. That's different, You have you're going out from a totally different context. You're not even being real. See, this is being subjective. This is really being subjective.
Yeah, as far as I see, I used Uranus, Neptune, Pluto for a period of time for specific purposes, and again, I don't use it on a regular basis. It's not present in my chart at all. I don't use them in my wheels, but except for the fact that I use the nodes. So I have 7 + 2, 9. That's it. So
I tried to use them. I did. I'll be very honest. When I was beginning in traditional astrology, it was one of those things that were kind of hard for me to leave behind, But I eventually did. You've seen the charts I produced. You'll never find them in my charts.
Yeah.
you won't find them. Because for me, if a planet is there, if it's in the same degree for 8 months, almost an entire year, it's going to be in that 1 degree. How many times is the planet's going to join it, leave it, and join it, leave it, and join it, leave it? It's ridiculous. Come on. Give it a break. It doesn't measure change. If it doesn't measure change, then it's not measuring time, And that's the problem with these very long durations. That's why they looked at the joinings of the longest periods of time was these periods of Jupiter and Saturn joining in Aries, forget how many thousand years it is, but it goes through a cycle where they come back to that and they start again But these cycles were very long periods in themselves, you know. And if you add Uranus and Neptune and Pluto in there, and you're talking about tens of thousands of years, you know. You're not just talking. So it's how it has no context to a human life, which on an average today, what is the length of life? 85 years, maybe in most countries.
Yeah, I mean
that is the cycle of Uranus.
Uranus.
To put it like that, that's one cycle of Uranus through all the signs.
Okay.
A lifetime.
Sure. I mean,
how can you make that personal? You can't. You can't. I'm sorry. The other planets are moving much faster. They measure time. That was the whole concept behind time to begin with. We measure time by the amount of change that happens. Okay. And that's why you had a major Time Lord system like Fedaria we were talking about, right? And they rule for the minor period of the planet, right? And then it hands over to the next planet. And we're talking about 9 years, 12 years at a time. You know, you're talking about long periods of time that it's ruling. Okay, even those are too big. So what did they come up with? They came up with zodiacal releasing is another one where you have bigger periods of time. Okay, you have these major general time lords, what they called chronocrators, you know, that were measured a great big space of time. But I remember reading in Vicis Valens, when you get to his, I think it's chapter 4, he says, oh, you had all these long periods, you have all these general, but then I came across this technique to be more precise. I talked about a year at a time. And he talks about perfections.
Perfections, yeah. So yeah. I think
outer planets, if people want to use it, free to use it for my, as far as I'm concerned, they can just go ahead and use it. But I'm not going to, it's up to them. I don't need it. I don't need it in my astrology and I don't use it. So it's that simple.
Cool.
And I can get very detailed in charts.
Yeah, I mean, it's for sure. It's I think many leading traditional astrologers have always pointed out that astrology can certainly be done without the outer planets. So, I mean, and I think there are so many. It's not just about natal astrology. Even when it comes to mundane astrology, I think there are books, mundane astrology books that were written in the medieval Arab world and also the Persian era. So, I mean, Ben Dykes has translated Astrology of the World, 2 parts. So, and Bonardi has done his version as well. So, there is scope for mundane astrology and almost perfect scope for it without the outer planets. So, it's basically the choice and whatever astrologers want to do as far as anything of this goes. So this is just one video that we have done. So
I mean, you have, if you look around in the world in a day, there's always something happening somewhere, right? There's always some kind of event. So the thing about astrology is that you always have to have, in natal astrology, we're dependent on what? We're dependent on a natal chart, right? You base everything on a beginning chart. That's the beginning of that native, right? I believe there's actually some books that are in the process of being translated. They're not yet. One from Umar and one from, his name was, he was an Indian astrologer in the courts of, in Baghdad. The name is on the tip of my tongue and I can't get it out. But anyway, they both wrote books called about beginnings to describe what is a beginning, you know? And that is the question, you know, what's the beginning of a nation? What's the beginning of this and that? Al-Biruni talks about it in his introduction to astrology. He says, well, how can you say when this river began? You know, he said, how much harder is it for a city? How can you say exactly when that city began? You know, when did it become a city? When did it become things like this? And then you look at how, in fact, those mundane astrologers, if you read in for example, the greater introduction, Abu Mashar makes a statement that there is absolutely, no, not in that, it was in Shadan, I think, that he makes a statement that there is no other sign that you can look at except Libra for the Arabs. Well, why does he say that? Or for the Islamics is actually what he was talking about. Why would he say that? Well, because the beginning chart for Islam had Libra on the ascendant. That's why. Very simple. It's not hard. If you look at the charts that he used, the Mashallah used, Umar used, the chart of the beginning of Islam was a chart it was the triplicity shift, Saturn and Jupiter when it moved into Scorpio. Okay, that chart showing it was the indicating the birth of the prophet, and had the moon in it had, of course, mashallah, he says it was in the 10th by division, but in the 9th of religion by counting. And he said that is the people of the religion, the moon, because the moon was there in the 9th house. So it was the people of the religion. So, I mean, I can understand why when I see things now, when I read things in Abu Mashar or read things from Mashallah, I could understand why, for example, Cancer was disastrous for the caliphs when Saturn and Mars would join in Cancer. Of course, it's both their detriments. It's one's fall and one's detriment. But it was worse than that. It was especially in caliphs and things that they were measuring their rules and riots and things like this by the joinings of Saturn and Mars. And it's because in Cancer, because the moon was in Cancer in the chart of the beginning of the religion. It was the people, it was the religion, what was going to happen to the religion, Libra as well. So these things are very obvious when you look at what they were using to make their delineations. So today, when we talk about, well, what chart do you use for England, for example, or, India, or, which chart are you? Well, India's been around for how many years?
No one knows.
Millennia. Who knows? Yeah, exactly. Who knows? The people, the culture, what makes India India has been there for millennia.
Yeah.
So what's the beginning? How can you make a beginning chart? A lot of people say, well, it was from when they got their independence from Britain. Not really. They were there long before that. The country was existing, and it just had a different form. It had different forms of government. And that's another thing I've noticed in the Persian astrology is that it could be a change of government, but it was still essentially the same. It was the same dynasty. This is why Abu Mashar called it dynasties, because the dynasty was Muhammad that set the dynasty. It was his dynasty. It was his rule, and it was the law, the Quran that made the laws that all the caliphs followed and everything else. Even through the Ottoman Empire, it was the same thing. It was Islam was the religion. It was the founding. It's like today, if you look at modern, this is something I've been doing. I've been looking a lot at the States, because the States was a very unique situation. It was a country that came from nothing.
Yeah.
There was never a country there, and then there was a country there. And I've been looking at all the charts, and you think about, and Abu Mashar talks about the establishment of a religion has always been the first. You have to have the law, and then the establishment of the law, and then the prophet, the law, and then the country. Basically, it was his recipe. And you look at the shift of the triplicity when it moved into the fire signs in Sagittarius. Now I'm using the mean conjunctions.
Mean conjunctions.
Yeah, I use the mean conjunctions. And I do that for a reason, because the planets don't do a thing. They're not doing anything, okay? A conception is a conception. And I'm holding myself to the conceptions that they had. I mean, they could calculate where the planets were. People say, well, they couldn't calculate. Yeah, they could. Abu Mashar did. He cast charts that showed them. So how are you telling me they couldn't do it? When they did it, I have charts to show you. They did it. But he used the mean conjunction. because only the mean conjunction gives you the regularity. It's like Plato's ideal, you know. There's this conjunction because the ideal would happen at this time, you know. Therefore, the other conjunction. And I was talking to Eshan about this. We had a little discussion about, and he says, well, and he was the first one that got me kind of interested, because he said, well, when you compare the real conjunctions with the mean conjunctions, for example, the last conjunction, when it was in Taurus, right? That's the real conjunction. But the mean conjunction was actually in Gemini. In other words, it shifted to air already. Okay, we've shifted to the air triplicity already in 2000, which explains a lot of things. Which explains, and if you look at it in the degrees that it was in Gemini and the rulers and how the chart was, well, I understand very much how there was this, people gave up freedom in order to have security, okay? This was a paradigm shift that has never been in history. I mean, even when you had Second World War, people didn't give up their rights in order to, you know, have freedom. You know, they went out, they fought tyranny, and they won, and they came home. Nothing changed as far as their society was concerned. Today, because a terrorist blew up a building, they were willing to give up freedoms that they had in order to have security. Look what's happening under this COVID crisis. It's the exact same thing. People allowing themselves to be imprisoned in their houses, to go around with a muzzle on all the time. For what? Fear, you know, because they've been told, if people, oh, it's bad, people get it. Well, it's not bad, people get it. People got the flu, and it wasn't a bad thing that people got the flu, even though with like if you talk about the Asian flu, for example, many children died because of it, because they were very susceptible to that flu. I don't want to get sidetracked on that, but I'm just saying that there was a paradigm shift in 2000 already when it shifted to the air signs, where freedom of expression was clamped down on. We gave up that freedom for security, you know, and that was already back in 2000, okay? 2000 and what happened in 2001, the Twin Towers, the wars in Iraq, and all these things started to happen. Homeland security started in America. All these things, and around the world, the fight against terrorism, the unseen enemy. So people give up all these freedoms that we had before in order to be safe here, okay? So this was a major paradigm shift already in the year 2000. And it happened in 2000. I mean, that was like you see it happen. And now we're going into the next air sign, into Aquarius. That is the, you know, seeking knowledge and thinking, you know, this kind of freedom to, you see it already happening now. Censorship has become the big thing. People being, not only freedoms being taken, but people are being censored, you know, from expressing opinions, from expressing knowledge. I see it all the time in America. And it's not that it's not, is it right? It's not, I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at the objective picture. This is what's happening. This is the objective people. You have Facebook, you have YouTube, you have all these censoring. For example, you had these people that came for, all these doctors that came out and said, well, we use hydroxychloroquine with this therapy, and we treat them earlier, and we've had very good results. That was banned. It was banned on Facebook, it was banned on YouTube, it was banned everywhere. They classified it as false information. We're already, according to mean conjunctions, we've already had it. The mean conjunction is already there.
Sure.
And I see the shift immediately in this year. I see the shift happening around me. This willingness that people give up more, not only personal freedom, but intellectual freedom. So it's like, you know, when I look at things mundanely, it's like, again, it's looking at it objectively, and I go back and I look at, okay, when was democracy established? Democracy as we know it in the free world, well, it was with the writers like John Locke. Probably was the biggest influencer of the fathers of the revolution in America, was the writings of John Locke. John Locke was born at the shift of the into the firesides. He was born after that. In other words, here's a new prophet who's writing all these things. His writings become the law, which is what happened. It's exactly what happened for a new dynasty that is America, which is why, it's like when you start seeing things through objective lenses instead of bipartisan or political, or, I'm apolitical. For me, as a Christian, I render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God things that are God's. That's where I'm at. For me, I can live in communism. I've lived under communism. I've lived in Islamic world. I've lived in closed societies. And I can live anywhere, because I respect their laws and I live, I don't worry about it. I just live my life. It's like people don't do this anymore. They're so wound up politically. They're so wound up with, and I read people, just panicking now because they're afraid Trump is going to get elected again. Oh my God. It's like, I feel sorry for people that they're at this point, it's become seriously deranging, but anyway, I don't want to talk about politics. What I wanted to say though, is mundane astrology also has to be objective.
Yeah, for sure. And it can also be done without the outer planets. I think that was the reason why you kind of went in length, which was actually very fascinating because,
I didn't mention one outer planet there.
Yes.
Because I don't have to. Because the conceptual language already took in account periods of time. Now I go back to what I said at the beginning, that I see this as a conceptual language. And the reason it works is because it's just a conceptual language, okay? When we make changes to the conceptual language, we're at the risk of damaging the conception, okay? This is what we're at. I'm not saying it's wrong to make changes, please. I live in I'm an engineer. We don't build the same. I've worked in the boat industry, building boats. We don't build boats the same way we built them 100 years ago, okay? Because there's new technology, there's new knowledge, there's things so that's not the point. But a boat is still a boat. It hasn't changed objectively, right? They tried to build a better boat with the Titanic, and look what happened to the Titanic. No, seriously, They thought they were being very clever by building these what they call bulkheads between compartments. The problem is that they stopped them at one deck, only the deck above water. Instead of building them all the way through the boat like they do today, they stopped they stopped I forget which deck it was, but they stopped. So when the boat started taking on water, it started sinking, and the water went over the bulkheads and just pulled the whole boat down. So the technology, they're trying to improve boats, was a big mistake. And actually, there was Norwegian engineers who told them it was a big mistake, but they didn't listen. Okay. They wanted to get the boat out there and get it floating. So, but anyway, my point is just as an allegory or as an example. It's okay to make changes. I'm not afraid of change. I'm not afraid of, when I look today and I see, well, okay, I had a major heart attack, I can't say that I only lived to be 60 years old, can I? I'm still alive. I'm 70 now. So it's like, why? What do I have to look at in the astrology to make it change, to make it a good change, so that it doesn't just throw this out with the baby in the bathwater, okay, well, we can't use this anymore. No, there's a reason, okay? The same reason that Abu Mashar told his student, well, how long did the grandfather live? It's like, astrology is, people try to make it too mystical and it's a very down to earth science, really. It's just being observant and experience and, understanding conceptions. Like I said, I don't believe the planets do anything. I mean, I know the sun warms the earth and its rays that make everything grow. If we didn't have the sun, there would be no photosynthesis, and there'd be no life on earth. If the moon wasn't there, the tides wouldn't work. There's certain functions that are very related to water. The woman's menstrual cycle is also influenced greatly on the phases of the moon. So all these things I realize have a physical, the moon and the sun, but where's the empirical evidence of the other planets? Mars, I mean, where's the evidence that it causes war? How can I say that? I mean, because also Venus being occidental in certain conditions can also, being in a sign of Mars, indicate war and strife. Or the opposition Jupiter to Saturn can indicate war and strife. So, and you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's not just one thing, and we code it, but you have to understand the whole principle behind things, and that it's not just one thing, and it's not just black and white. That's traditional astrology, in my experience.
Sure. I mean, I think we touched upon more than just one area. And
we wanted an organic discussion.
Yes, that's what. So, it's a, it's a wide range of topics that we have touched upon, and I'm so glad that we had this chance to do it. And I think this pretty much brings towards the end of this discussion, but it's up to the astrologer who wants to make the change and see whether it happens.
For me,
or not.
People do what they do. I'm not going to sit and argue with them or fight.
Yeah.
I see this in a lot of astrologers, and I'm not looking for that. That's not interesting to me. It solves nothing. It just creates more problems. I mean, if somebody wants to use a mundane house system, fine. Yeah, great. Okay. I'm not going to say mine is better than yours. I'm just going to say that I practice astrology, and this is what I've learned from traditional astrology, and I find it the most consistent results are this way for me. And there's always this risk that when you say, well, it works for me, so therefore it's good. I'm going to do it this way because it works for me. That's not really a good excuse either. That's kind of a very cheap cop-out in itself.
Yeah.
There should be a basis behind why you say that. What is it about it that makes you want to use it? And I have a list of things that I've tried to list a few of them here, why I think it's okay. And I'm sure I would get a lot of people arguing because I know a lot of people use mundane systems, and that's fine. Great. No problem for me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this, as you said, people do what they do. So it's just what we think of what we are doing, and what could possibly be a good platform or understanding to kind of make the change. So,
Yes.
But this is strictly your view and my view, and not a very,
That's the truth.
There's nothing dogmatic about it. So
no.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had to change things from the time I studied with Robert Zoller. I've gone through this development also, growing up in it, so to speak.
Yeah.
I hate the word evolution because I didn't evolve or anything. I just grew up. I started seeing things as an adult, as objectively, and learning to look at things like that. And that's why I'm where I am. Why I do the things that I do, and why I make the predictions I make. And it's. Is it perfect? No. Am I? Yeah, no. Like I said, I've made mistakes. I'm about, I probably get about 95% right,
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Which is good odds.
Yeah, for sure.
Nobody's getting.
I mean, I'd get a reading from an astrologer who gets 95% times right. So
Yeah, I mean,
that's basically what we all need. So
and if I get something wrong and somebody comes back and says, no, that didn't happen, then I say, okay, explain to me what happened. And then I learn, right? That's the whole purpose of having clients. That's why I have a good client relationship with people, because it's also a learning
yeah.
for me, you know. Later, I actually have an experience that just recently happened because I did a chart for a gentleman. It was all the way back in 2005 or 2006, one of my first traditional clients. And he just recently got in contact because he saw me in this other interview from Michael.
Uh-huh.
And so he visited my webpage. I saw he visited my webpage. So I sent him a letter. I said, how are you doing, man? I said, it's been a long time. And, oh, wow, you saw that? And we started talking again. And I said, do you have a copy of the chart that you did for me? Because mine was destroyed in a flood. And I said, oh, sure. So I sent him a new copy. And I just got a letter back from him. I said, wow. He said, everything that you said here has happened in my life. He said, this is so mind-blowing to sit and look at this chart 15 years later. And I see already everything that's happened in my life. He said, the things you said and counseled me in this letter, he said, were 100% correct.
Wonderful.
You get those kind of back messages and you think, well, I got away with that one. You know, I've had other people get really irritated, right? And say, no, that's right. So, it's always good to get that good, positive feedback.
Sure.
I was going to say melding. That's Norwegian. You wouldn't understand that. Okay, Ashwin, I'm going to shut up.
No. I think, the discussion won't end at all. So, it was a fascinating discussion, and I would love to kind of do it as and when it is possible on a more frequent basis. So
we can talk anytime. You know that.
Yeah. Yes, sure.
And we do.
Yeah,
we
of course.
Different things offline, or should I say, on the side, not.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I hope this organic discussion is going to be useful or was useful.
I hope so.
Yeah. So because there's been a lot of discussions on social media about what's happening. There is always an ongoing debate between modern and traditional astrologers. So it's just about putting a few words from our own side and see how people receive it. But as we already said, there is nothing dogmatic. So which pretty much brings us to the close. And thank you so much for joining. And
thank you for having me, Ashwin. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
I don't, like I said before, I'm not somebody who's going to get out in front and wave a flag and say, you got to do everything this way.
Yeah.
It's nice to be able to discuss it with you and just to kind of share my heart, about the subjects. So.
That's basically, I also want to kind of record what we all think as astrologists during our times. So maybe after 10 years or 20 years, the next generation will come up and see if they happen to see this, and they might wonder what astrologers before 20 years were thinking. So it's an entirely different ballgame. So
maybe, who knows?
Yeah, it makes them wonder. Yeah, that's basically the purpose of doing all these. I don't do this for clientele. So I just do this for, for record. So it's good. So people see Steven.E.Birchfield having these ideas, and they go to their website and read what this Birchfield guy thinks about this.
Yeah, what's this guy think? Sounds like he's a little bit out there,
It's fascinating. So and let's before closing, I just wanted to ask about your coursework, and I know you've been putting a lot of effort and time to develop your course, and you're almost more than halfway through it. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all of a sudden I've got my client work has increased over
Okay.
the last few months, and I'm still working on the course. I still am. It's a balancing act now because I've realized that I don't like to take any more than 3 clients a month,
Okay.
simply because I have other things that I have one student that's my guinea pig and taking my course and going through making comments, and I'm seeing how the student is growing, if they're getting everything, if they're being able to actually do the astrology. So see how effective it is. So I'm having to write this, and as I'm writing, I get asked things. So it's, my course, I would like to have it finished by the end of the year.
Oh, that's great. So
So
even if it
that's
is
my
end of the
goal.
year.
That's my goal is, by the new year that I'll have this course pretty much done. So, and I know that's Ben's goal as well. I've had to kind of consider and say, well, if Ben's producing a course, why do I want to put it? I mean, he's going to put out a really good course, I'm sure. It's like, why should I have a course also? Like, but then there's a lot of people in the world. There's a lot of different, so I guess there's room for everybody.
Yeah, I
I
think
don't really want to compete with anybody. I'm not out there to compete with.
for sure.
I don't need it. To put it very simply, when I retired, I have a pension because I had very good work. So my pension is good enough for me to live on, and be able to practice astrology and do astrology on the side is only just a slight. It just gives me that little extra. So that, I mean, I'm 70. Hopefully, I mean, I have other things that I do. I have my own martial arts school, for
Yeah,
example.
that's fascinating.
I teach combat. I teach close combat to not only students, but I teach police. I teach military. I teach. I mean, it's something I've been doing for 40, 45 years or so, something like this. So and I have my own school here, so I have students, and so I have a lot of things that kind of that I'm involved with, doing a lot of things in my life. Astrology is very important to me, but other things
But
are.
probably you should just make a note and mention that no one should get into a punching game with you. So
You know what? I'm a very easygoing person.
I was just joking.
I mean, why would you want to fight somebody over a parking spot? Come on. Really, seriously, I watch people get really upset and, start, getting violent. I go, why? I mean, it's not necessary. You can have the parking space. I remember as when I was younger, if I went into a bar, it happened one time that I actually bumped into somebody, they spilled their beer, and I said, oh, I'm really sorry. Let me buy you a new beer. I'm sorry, did I ruin your clothes? It's like, okay.
Sure.
I mean, why are you going to look for conflict? Conflict is like, surprisingly, I have the ruler of my ascendant in the 7th, so you would think that, that's conflict is something that's going to make me happy.
I think it's about getting into relationships and collaborations. So
yes, it is. It's. I mean, I don't like conflict. There's an author, an American author. His name was Isaac Asimov. You probably heard of him. Science fiction writer. He was a scientist as well. He wrote a series of books called the Foundation series, and in one of them he said, it was a very interesting quote. It's one that stuck with me a long time. He said, "Violence is the last resort of the incompetent." That quote just stuck with me for many years. I mean, it's true. Violence is the last resort of the incompetent. If you can't resolve the issue, it always falls down to violence.
That's true.
Anyway, I studied violence in order to avoid violence, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's the basic idea of any form of martial arts. So it's about knowing when to not exhibit the art. So more than just exhibiting. So yeah.
I can, on two hands, the number of times I've had to use martial arts. So
Yeah.
no more
Great.
than that. But
So
things happen. Things do happen in life. Just to, so you
yeah,
know,
I mean,
you find yourself in
unexpected
a
things.
situation that you have to defend
Yes.
yourself.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So I hope you get your course out by the end of the year as planned, and I'm sure it's going to be amazing and great. So
Wow. You've read part of it.
yeah. So
I said,
the first
I
part.
asked you to proofread some of it.
Yes, the first
I
part
didn't
was.
know what it's all about.
Yes, so, I mean it was wonderful. So I mean I can only imagine what a student can actually gain from it. So I mean leaps and bounds. So thank you so much for doing this, even after you really did not have to do all of these things. So it's going to be a great contribution, and thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining today. And
We'll talk again. Actually.
yeah,
We'll talk
we'll do
whenever
it.
you want.
Sure. So
You
thank you
know
so
where to
much.
find me.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Take care.